Hi, welcome to the Clarke-Palmore House. My name is Lisa with Henrico Recreation and Parks. If you haven't explored the first part of the tour, exploring the grounds around Clarke-Palmore, please look in the description box below to watch that first. Today, we're going to explore the inside of the house and learn more about the family. Come join me. We're standing now on the inside hallway of the house. Originally, if you recall from my colleague Bryce's first video, he mentioned that this was built in the 1820s as a one-story house. In fact, it wasn't just one story, it was basically just one room with a side hallway here and a room next to it, which we'll explore in a moment. This hallway, though, has changed a little bit because, as it being a one-story house, the stairwell would not have been here. If you remember also in the first video, my colleague Bryce mentioned the ghost windows on the outside wall. Well, those were bricked over so that the stairwell behind me could be added. The front door, which is directly behind the camera, was placed exactly across from the back door. This was to allow good airflow through the house during the time period in which air conditioning hadn't been invented yet. John Clark bought the house and lands from Daniel Higginbottom's estate in 1855. He had a very young and growing family. He moved here with his wife Mildred, along with 5 children total eventually, including 2 sets of twins. This is a picture of John Clark, him as an older gentleman. John Clark was primarily a farmer here on the house and grounds, although according to family oral tradition, he also worked nearby at Tredegar Ironworks down near the river. Of John and Mildred Clark's 5 children, it's interesting that the house eventually passed to their daughter named Estelle, which you can see pictured right here on the mantle. Estelle was born around 1860. And by about 1880, she was a teacher at a one-room schoolhouse here in Henrico County. Now, she did stay with her parents and cared for them during their elderly years. John Clark, her father, passed away in 1909. And a year later, in 1910, she married this gentleman next to her, John Palmore. He would continue with the family's farming practices here and also eventually acquired 40 acres out on Route 5. We know that they took his produce from his orchards down to the Churchill area to sell as well. John and Estelle Palmore did not have any biological children, so they decided to adopt a little girl, which they named Vera, after Estelle's sister, who had died in her early 20s. Vera, who you can see pictured here, was the little girl who grew up in this house in the 1930s during the Great Depression. Vera decided to follow in her mother's footsteps, becoming a school teacher. She attended the State Teachers College, which today we know as the University of Mary Washington. She couldn't immediately get a teaching job, though, because the Great Depression was in full swing. But she did eventually land a position teaching 7th grade here with Henrico County Public Schools in 1937. She would continue as a classroom teacher for the next 23 years until moving up as a supervisor of elementary education until her retirement in 1977. The gentleman who you see pictured here next to her is the gentleman she would marry. His name is George Morton, and they married in the mid-1940s. Now, as you can see from how he's dressed, he's not a farmer. In fact, he was a government purchasing agent. So farming on the property started to decline after World War II here. George and Vera would live here for most of the rest of their lives until Vera decided to donate the house and property in 1999 to Henrico County. Even though the Clarke-Palmore House was first built in the 1820s and added on to a couple more times, we interpret the house actually as the 1930s Great Depression era. You might find that interesting why we do something like that. And part of it is because we have a great variety of other 19th century historic houses throughout Henrico County. But the 1930s is a very unusual time period, not just here in Henrico or Virginia, but actually across the United States. In fact, there are probably less than a dozen historic house museums that interpret that time period. One of the interesting things about the Great Depression era is the rise in technology or lack thereof. In fact, the 1930 census asked a very unusual question. They wanted to know if the homeowner had a radio. So, in fact, the Clarke-Palmore family said no. What you're seeing behind me here is a Victrola. It's a record player. Now, we don't know if the Palmores had a Victrola here, but we definitely know that they did not have a radio at that time. Before we move from the living room into the dining room, our next room, I wanted to stop briefly and show you the thickness of the wall here. This is where the 1820s part of the house met the 1910 addition behind, and it really illustrates how thick the walls were, including several courses of brick. A lot of our visitors comment often on just a one-room house, and it's not overly impressive from the 1820s. But let me just point out that in the 1820s, to have a house made out of solid brick was fairly costly compared to having one built out of clapboard. We're standing now in the 1910 edition of the house. This, of course, is the family dining room. The table that you see in front of me did belong to the family. However, we don't know if it's the family's actual dining room table. Vera actually told us a story that she recalls as a child it being set up on the side porch for the farmhands to come and eat their lunch and dinner at. So we don't know if it was a regularly used piece by the family. Another original family item is this small little buffet table here behind me. One other interesting thing I wanted to share with you is about the story of when the house became electrified. And that was in 1933. And we happen to know that because it was on Vera's 20th birthday. She was very excited about this and recalls it very fondly because she didn't have to clean the blacking out of the lamp globes anymore. This was part of a larger thing that happened during the Great Depression. It was instituted by the federal government as the Rural Electrification Project. So across America, many rural communities, though not all, were being electrified. Welcome to the family's 1910 edition of their kitchen. Now, in the 1930s, it's a great example of a blending of old technology and new technology with kitchen and other household gadgets. I have a couple of great examples to share with you of this. One is the stove over here next to the door. It's an electric oven and stove. And for many housewives, this was a hugely popular change. And the reason why they wanted to take advantage of it, well, there were many, in fact. Think about what it would require to keep a wood stove for cooking going. Chopping of firewood, hauling the firewood in, the mess of firewood, the cooking, trying to establish a good temperature for the oven, and then the cleaning out of the coals afterwards. It was a big feat to do 3 times a day for each meal. So many housewives certainly would be encouraged to get an electrical oven. It didn't take much encouragement, in fact, and the federal government did provide incentives to purchase electrical appliances. Another electrical appliance could be a refrigerator. Yes, they had those then, though the technology wasn't quite as well established. So you'll see in our corner, there's an ice box instead of a refrigerator. And that is partly because the technology, again, for a refrigerator was still really being proven. And an ice box was much less messy to maintain and less costly than, say, a wood-burning stove to an electrical stove. Now, Vera and her mother, Estelle, seemed to like cooking because they collected a lot of kitchen gadgets. We have an immense collection that belonged to the ladies, a mixture probably of family heirlooms and things they found at antique stores. We hope to show you some of these collections in our future mini episode on kitchen household technology. This little bedroom at the top of the stairs first belonged to Estelle and her sister Vera when they were girls. Now later on, Estelle's daughter Vera would have lived in this room from her childhood through actually adulthood. So this is made to look like Vera's bedroom in the 1930s Great Depression era when she was a teenager at the time. Now, eventually, after Vera married in the mid-1940s, her father, John Palmore, moved into this room. After his death in 1952, technology a little bit more arrived in this room. Initially, all of the people who lived here would have used an indoor commode or toilet with the chamber pot concealed inside. But after John Palmore's death in 1952, Vera and her husband George converted this little room into their bathroom with a full tub and a flushing toilet. This larger bedroom at the top of the stairs belonged to the 3 generations of married couples who lived here. The colonial revival style bedstead you see did not belong to the family, but it was an incredibly popular style at the time. You'll also see next to the bedstead a wooden trunk. In fact, this trunk is one of the oldest family items that we own. It dates to about the early 1850s, and we do have a family story behind it. It was created by a family friend of John and Mildred Clark's, and it was a gift to them when they got married. As the family story goes, the friend who made this trunk for them actually died before it could be finished, and John and Mildred decided to leave the trunk unfinished in remembrance of their family friend. On the other side of me, you'll see an early 1900s era sewing machine. Both Vera and her mother Estelle not just sewed out of necessity, but also sewed out of pleasure. They truly enjoyed it. And this can be demonstrated in the fact that both ladies love to collect different sewing gadgets. And in fact, we have a huge sewing collection belonging to the 2 ladies, which we hope to feature in a future mini episode. Thank you for joining me today as we explored the interior of the Clarke-Palmore House Museum. Be sure to check out the other tour of the exterior house and grounds tour. And don't forget to check our website for any upcoming events or programs here.